A group of young painters, inspired by the earlier generation of Eugène Delacroix, Gustave Courbet, Eugène Boudin, and Johann Jonckend, developed a close relationship and a new way of painting. Yet the Academy curbed their ambition and bitterly despised their new style of art. It was time for these pioneers to break free from state tutelage and to proudly exhibit independently. But this would not be achieved without creating tensions and contradictions.
On va rentrer dans le vif du sujet maintenant, ce sont les expositions de ce jeune groupe. Alors évidemment, il manque Basile, puisque Basile est resté sur le champ de bataille.
The concept of a group is tempered by the plurality of different painters handling techniques and by the de facto absence of a leader. It is certain that Frédéric Basile's death would have felt like a missing piece in the puzzle of the Impressionist saga. I will now describe a sequence of 8 exhibitions known as the Impressionist exhibitions, an expression that will survive the test of time and will define our group of painters. The idea of an independent exhibition slowly forms in the minds of these young painters who are tired of too many Salon refusals. Even if, in 65 and 66, Claude Monet would make his way to the Salon, in 67, however, he, Alfred Sisley, and Auguste Renoir would be rejected, a slap in the face of an ambitious generation. On behalf of his friends, Basile writes a letter to the famous Emilien de Nieuwerkerque, intendant of Beaux-Arts of Napoleon III, this same man to whom Gustave Courbet said, "You are your government, but so am I am my own government," to paraphrase. Remember, he sent a letter signed by the whole group, including Claude Monet, Sisley, Renoir, Johann Jonckend, Charles-François d'Aubigny, etc., which was received on the 1st of April 1867. The intendant took it to be a joke, and so they never received an answer for their claim to open a new Salon de Refusés, where they could exhibit their canvases. Imagine their situation. They were people with scarce financial means who invested everything in their paintings. But if their paintings were not even accepted, then their hopes of sales were wiped out. What was the future for them? In the 70s, Berthe, Morisot, Sisley and Basile, with the paintings that I showed you, and Renoir with Bather with a Griffon terrier that we had previously seen, were all accepted to the Salon.
De Courbet sont présents au Salon.
But Monet was refused and d'Aubigny quit the jury. Manet tried to appease the jury, and Louis Edmond Duranty said something along the lines of, "We have reached the point where we should organise our own exhibition." We don't know who was first, but Duranty at least mentioned it, and so did Basile. I think the idea was just spreading, its precedent having been set in 55 and 67, with both Courbet and Manet's independent exhibitions. Bear in mind that while the purpose of these exhibitions was to present the paintings, it was above all to sell them, since the artists had to make a living by their brush. This was not, however, the case for Basile, and anyway he had passed away by this point. While the others had to sell, Paul Durand-Ruel would start acquiring them and selling them. But why not take the matter into their own hands? This is how the first exhibition of a so-called anonymous society of painters, sculptors, printmakers came into being. Nowhere was it mentioned that it was an Impressionist exhibition. It was an anonymous society whose status was derived from the Bakery Association of Pontoise. The mastermind behind the idea was Camille Pissarro, a staunch yet fair egalitarian. The exhibition was set in the Grand Boulevards at 35 Boulevard des Capucines, the studios of photographer Félix Tourneschamp, who was known as Nadar. Here is the first floor facing north. It allowed an extraordinary light to fill the room. It is almost as if you were in a painter's studio, with its spacious and airy area for hanging the works. It's nothing like the claustrophobic crowding of the works at the Salon where, as I showed you before, the paintings were hung from the ground to the ceiling. The Impressionists were therefore linked with the Grand Boulevards as the district of theatres, shops and hotels. Marxist historians from the second half of the 20th century severely criticised Impressionism as a cultural product of early consumerism. It is true that both Impressionism and consumerism were both born in 1870 and achieved critical and commercial success in the 80s and 90s, when sales intensified. But this would make for another subject. So this exhibition had a commercial purpose. The entry cost of 1 franc paid the group a little dividend, since they had paid Nadar to use his gallery. Some 30 different artists presented nearly 200 works, or 165 to be precise.
Pour 250 ou 260, enfin un grand nombre de tableaux quand même.
The names in green are those who we will call the Impressionists. In red are the regular Salon painters, and in black are the second class or amateur painters, even if Stanislas Lépine was slightly better known and preferred the Salon. I hope this coloured list helps visualise the dilution or the relegating of the future Impressionists among the mass of exhibitors.
Seulement dans cette exposition.
I have underlined the leaders or organisers. Pissarro could have led them. He had been the master of Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin, but he was too much of an egalitarian when judging and making decisions. As for Monet, he tried to be, and some wished he was, the leader of the group. But the problem was that he was too much of an individualist and functioned on an all-for-me principle. He spoke to journalists and obtained signatures, but in general, he promoted his paintings and not those of the group. The one who took charge, the one who had the stature, status, solid training and the experience, was Edgar Degas. The problem was that he was a draftsman and a painter of figures. He was definitely not an open-air painter, so as an Impressionist leader, maybe he wasn't best suited for the role. Returning to the Anonymous Society of Painters, it was a non-ideological, practical and economical exhibition society. It put on show works that provoked some interesting reactions. The major newspapers wrote nothing or little on the subject. Les Temps, Les Montiers Universels, the 19th Century, or Émile Zola's former journal, L'Événement, just ignored the exhibition. There were some 52 mentions of the exhibition. 9 were just announcing the event, while the others added qualifying mentions. 20 were favourable, 18 were mixed, and only 5 were openly hostile, but without making a big scandal. Eventually, after 10 days, 2 newspapers published hostile accounts. Le Journal Amusant, which bears its name well, and Les Charivari, both of which were humorous periodicals aiming for a good laugh.
Faire rire. Celui qui va écrire.
I will summarise the Charivari articles written by a certain Louis Leroy. Leroy, we are too rarely told, was a landscape painter from the 1830s until the 60s. He even exhibited at the Salon, yet is largely unknown. He set his criticism as a conversation between a painter and a young man guiding him. As Leroy advances through the exhibition, our medalist painter stops before ploughed field. But he was seeing quite clearly and naively thought his spectacles were dirty. So he wiped them carefully and replaced them on his nose, suddenly harumphing and exclaiming, "By Michelin, it had neither head nor tail." His young guide insisted on the hoarfrost impression. Then he moves on to another painting, this time by Mademoiselle Morisot, and cries, "She makes exactly as many brush strokes lengthwise as there are fingers, and the business is done." He then passes in front of harvesters and exclaims, "Wow!" He fantastically states, to paraphrase, "There are too many strips of colour. One would be enough." In his delirium, he denies that his gods, Michelin and Berthe, are no longer trying to clean his glasses. Then, all of a sudden, he stops in front of catalogue number 98 and asks for the work's title. Impression, Sunrise. Here is Monet's famous work, to which Leroy responds, "Impression? I was certain of it. I was just telling myself that, since I was impressed, there had to be some impression in it. And what freedom, what ease of workmanship, wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished than that seascape." So he recognises a marine and compares it to a vulgar first impression, before adding, "Taking the point of view of the Impressionists, I was impressed." This is how the term Impressionist is coined. But catastrophe seems imminent. His countenance turns a deep red, and standing in front of Monet's breakfast, he yells, "Too finished, too finished! Talk to me of the modern Olympia." In full delirium, he starts a scalp dance, driven to insanity by these horrors in front of him. This is how a farce gave birth to the term Impressionist.
On parlera de la peinture impressionniste. Alors on a parlé d'un...
It is not easy to define the Impressionists as a coherent group.
Pendant la pause, Manet n'expose...
It is sometimes said that the Impressionists are those who simply participated in the exhibitions called Impressionist, comprising 8 exhibitions held between 1874 and 78. But I remind you that Manet never participated in these exhibitions, and so this definition would therefore exclude him. Consequently, we must not be too strict with the label of Impressionism. It exists and it is useful, but on the condition of being careful with the myths that accompany the term. I propose that we now spend some time travelling and visiting the exhibitions one by one. We need to ask, who exhibited, who organised, and what did they put on show?
La deuxième exposition qui a lieu chez Durand-Ruel, rue Pelletier,
The second exhibition took place in 1876 at Durand-Ruel's, 11 rue Pelletier, 2 years after the first. You notice that the exhibitors are less numerous. The majority of names are still in black, that is, of secondary artists, and the core group is still in green and includes Millet and Cal, 2 older artists. I have also underlined the names of Gustave Caillebotte and Degas. Degas, who was present in almost all the exhibitions, actively participated in their organisation. But the more he got involved, the more he left his mark. This meant he largely favoured the entry of figure painters. Yet when we think of the Impressionists, what crosses our mind are landscape painters like Monet. At the exhibition of the group, Degas permitted more and more painters. These were maybe less brilliantly academic, but were predominantly figure painters. I emphasise the name of Caillebotte, a major patron of the movement, because I want to remind you that the legacy of his large donation to the National Museums of Luxembourg and to the Louvre still constitute the basis of the Impressionist collection of Orsay. The third exhibition, that was it. The denomination was finally accepted among the critics and exhibitors. At the time of the exhibition, Rivière published a newspaper called L'Impressionist. Caillebotte and Degas were still at hand to assist with its organisation, and Cezanne exhibited for the second but last time, because later he will receive an inheritance from his father and can escape the commercial pressures of being an artist. But in the meantime, this great yet bashful man could not stand the criticism and began refusing to exhibit if it was not at the Salon. Now for the fourth exhibition. Again, the name Impressionist disappeared from this exhibition. It was neither on the cover of the catalogue, nor was it mentioned in a related publication. The number of exhibitors is reduced, with neither Renoir nor Sisley among the exhibitors. Identifying the Impressionists as the exhibitors shows its limits, since it reveals the definition's fragility. If Monet presented nearly 30 paintings, it was because Caillebotte recovered paintings from private collections in '79, including 2 of his own. He also went in search of others in Monet's studio, because otherwise it was unlikely that Monet would make the effort to exhibit with the Impressionists, a label that does not itself unite. Caillebotte and Degas, as always, were devoted to the organisation, but it was not before long Caillebotte would express his reproach towards Degas, arguing he was not fair or generous, and it is true that Degas was known as having an acid personality. Then there were always the Salon painters' names such as Bracquemond, the etcher and friend, and new characters such as Jean-Louis Forain, who cause more disagreement within the group. For the so-called fifth exhibition of a group of independent artists, the Impressionist appellation is still on the agenda. Here is their poster where many secondary names appear again. In red is the name of Raffaelli, who was mainly a painter, not necessarily a salon painter, but mainly a so-called naturalist painter. As expected, his presence caused a stir among the Impressionists that I indicated in green. Gauguin was particularly disgruntled because Degas had invited artists who painted figures, which was far from the interests of those who painted outdoor landscapes. As a result, there was no more Monet, no more Renoir, and no more Sisley. Only Caillebotte and Degas remained, but in strained terms. The following year, at the sixth exhibition, there were only 13 participants. Degas was still there, and he pushed for the entry of Forain and Raffaelli. However, this offended Gauguin, who succeeded in excluding Raffaelli the following year. As a result, Renoir and Sisley returned, much to the disdain of Degas, who left. You can measure the degree of disagreements by looking at this game of in and out.
Degas, il n'y a plus de Monet. Monet, lui, il est au Salon.
And now for the last exhibition. 4 years had elapsed. 4 years without Impressionist exhibitions, that is. But why was this? Because the artist sold more and more outside the boundaries of the exhibition. Monet did not participate, neither did Renoir nor Sisley. But Degas was back together with Seurat and Signac. The end of the Impressionist exhibitions was nigh, culminating with Seurat's Sunday afternoon, that Félix Fénéon declared as being neo-impressionist.
Fénéon appellera le néo-impressionniste.
I suggest that we now look more closely at these paintings one after another. Obviously, we cannot consider all, but we will look at a small and meaningful selection, with the hope of spotting Impressionism's key characteristics. Renoir exhibited this torso, nude in the sunlight, in 76. When we speak of effect, as Leroy spoke of the impression of Monet's seascape, we refer to a vibrant and quick stroke. It was not a coincidence that this painting appeared in the catalogue under the single title of Étude, a French study that obviously renounced any claim of being in a finished state. In 1876, the critics increasingly used the term impressionistic, like Wolf from Le Figaro, who criticises Renoir's work. We recognise a landscape built with long and quick brushstrokes in blue, yellow and white. This woman is naked and real, rather than nude and academically distant, because neither the treatment nor the subject match the norms of nude painting. The touch is visibly breaking the rules of finish and tonal gradation. On the top she wears a contemporary bracelet and ring, so if Renoir had painted a Greek nymph, then I doubt she would have worn 19th century jewellery. Therefore, the nude is undressed and embedded in her time. Wolf called these green and purple patches of paints the signs of advanced putrefaction in a corpse, patches for the shadows that you can notice here. Again, it is as though the model's body was retrieved from the morgue, a critique already formulated against Manet's Olympia. So yes, it was called an Impressionist painting because it defied academic norms in its colour treatment and brushstrokes. Critics admitted so, since it was presented under the title Étude, meaning study. I suggest we continue with Pissarro. During the 70s, Pissarro tended to work on landscapes from a close perspective, especially after his return from London. Typically he incorporated hills, vegetable gardens, farm works and orchards, as we see here. Bear in mind that he studied the masters of Barbizon, who indulged in rural subjects. But his colour treatment and brushstroke would soon show a departure from these tendencies. Here Pissarro uses clear tones without backlighting, and this absence of chiaroscuro has a uniting effect on the painted surface through academic finish. The white flowers of the plum trees show clumps of impasto. So yes, we can speak of Impressionist painting. We can speak of Impressionism, if Impressionism is the denial of half-tone, modelling and finish. Let us continue with Monet and Sisley. Today, when we come across such paintings by Monet, we are quick to identify it as being Impressionist, on the basis of its bright colours and visible strokes. It's the same with this view of Port Marly underwater.
2016 qu'il y a des inondations. En 76, c'est Port Marly qui est sous l'eau.
You can notice a detached and visible stroke that we saw earlier in Delacroix's work, while blue asserts itself against the normative finish and tonal graduation. Actually, this series by Sisley sold very well. In spite of the Impressionists' apparent coherence, there are other works signed by these names in black or red, such as Bracquemond, an early friend of the Impressionists who was not necessarily one of them stylistically. When I see his hair, I can only think of naturalism. It is closer to Dürer's hair than to an impression. Nevertheless, he exhibited 3 times at the Impressionist exhibitions, nearly as often as Renoir or Sisley. Now let's turn to Caillebotte, where there is a slit in the upper left of his portrait. He was a Norman friend of Honfleur and regular exhibitor at the Salon. You might see something Impressionist in his bluish indefiniteness, but the blur is linked to the close-up, and his subject is similar to Millet's absorbed figures. Any possible feelings of doubt disappear when showing this other work. If there is some sense of autonomy in Caillebotte's brushstrokes, his brown palette reveals a completely different agenda. Now on to Degas. He is the one who would participate in all but one of the exhibitions. I remind you that Degas was very academic in his way. He was among the best draftsmen of the 19th century and was a master in composition. His painting process is painstaking because he multiplies sketches and studies. Degas was admitted to the Beaux-Arts Academy but preferred to copy the masters from Le Louvre and Italian galleries, a task that occupied him for 3 years. He admired Delacroix and Ingres, to whom he showed his drawings. We feel the fragility of the group because the one who was the de facto organiser of the exhibitions was passionate about figure drawing above all and renounced landscape. He loved to have an elusive perspective to create a bolder composition and was always reworking his paintings with different medias from all possible angles. Degas presented ballet rehearsal on stage at the first Impressionist exhibition. In fact, I am cheating a little bit by showing you this repetition because when I return to the first exhibition's catalogue, I read that he had exhibited a drawing under the same title. I assume that they are similar since you have a precise, refined and controlled composition, far away from what is collectively assumed as being Impressionist. It is something of an optical impression that has been thrown down onto the canvas. Women on a Café terrace is pastel on monotype. Let us take a small technical break and ask, what is a monotype? It is a unique print, hence the name monotype. It is created using the following process. Ink or another printing product is applied directly onto a non-porous plate, which is pressed against the paper to transfer the pigment, as with an etching plate. Therefore, the artist paints in ink or gouache onto a plate, which is usually made of glass, then presses it onto a paper sheet so that the plate can be reused after cleaning. Degas produced a number of important monotypes, in particular the so-called pornographic ones. He also pressed the plate onto paper and then reworked it with pastel. In the 19th century, pastels were already sticks of colour, which meant that he retained the gesture of a draftsman rather than that of a painter. Here again is the proof of his very academic tendency to favour line over colour. And yet it was him who most frequently organised the Impressionist exhibitions.
Dans ses travaux colorés chez Degas, et pourtant c'est lui qui va organiser les impressionnistes.
Renoir presented a young dancer at the first exhibition, who Leroy actually misidentifies as being Guillaumin's and mocks for having legs as cottony as the gauze of her skirts. It is true that the same white and blue strokes are marking her legs, bar, arms and tutu, but her face is properly defined.
Du geste qui est propre à Renoir, cette touche très fine, très légère.
The same free and recognisably rapid brushstrokes are in L'Éloge, yet the face is softly modelled.
Qui est parfait, et Degas,
Renoir was mostly a portrait painter, which is how he made his living. As early as the 80s, he reproached the Impressionists for lacking volume, for rendering the body's presence ephemerally, and Renoir returned to depicting continuous contours, just like Morisot.
Redessiné, Morisot fera la même chose.
Cezanne presented this painting at the third exhibition. I will take the opportunity to show you a portrait of Victor Choquet by Renoir, which was shown at the second exhibition in 77.
Possible, mais c'est pas certain. Victor Choquet, lui, il est dans les...
Choquet was present at the exhibition and was willing to defend his portrait from scathing mockery, or worse, protect it against potential umbrella attacks.
Plus des coups d'autres coups du public choqué, du public choqué.
Here is Choquet presented by Cezanne, where thick strokes are juxtaposed to give an impression of clay modelling, with no attempt paid to the volume's tonal modulation. Some fingerprints are even left on it. But look at the work by Renoir. It was considered to be as impressionistic as Cezanne's, yet it is so refined that it reminds me of English aestheticism. It is an exquisite work with fused and delicate strokes. Look at the tip of the nose, the delicacy of the fingers and the neatness of the hair. I am not convinced that we can associate this with the Impressionists' detached and forthright strokes. If we think of Impressionism as a style, then we need to remove a large number of paintings, and in particular some portraits by Renoir. Renoir exhibited these portraits at the third exhibition, driven by a commercial purpose, since he was searching for clients. His patrons would say that they wanted to pose with such and such a jewel in such and such an angle. He had the skills to sensualize a woman's face, a softness that recalled Jean-Honoré Fragonard, Antoine Watteau, and the French Rococo. Still, his recognizable and so-called impressionist stroke freely decorates the wall behind his sitter on the left, and is similar to his nude in the sunlight. Yet the face's definition is perfect. If you look at the eyebrows of this woman, we could almost count the hairs. You all know Luncheon of the Boating Party from 1881, an impressionist icon that was one of the last to be painted in this style. Was it a visual impression rendered quickly onto canvas? He seems to have worked extensively on this painting, and since it took him 4 months to paint, impressionistic claims are therefore out of the question. The remaining possibility is that he could have painted it directly in nature. Did he actually paint this group of friends for 4 months outside? It is true that we have no preparatory works or underdrawings, but I still find it difficult to believe that he painted this work outside for 4 months, because the weather and light in Paris would have changed constantly. I can only assume that he cautiously composed his painting as an impression. Renoir retains the light and vibrant stroke for the decor and landscape, while once again the faces are finished. I'd like to take this opportunity to show you a small painting of The Reader by Fragonard in reverse mode, so that you can see the similarity between the face of this reader and that of the young woman, Aileen, his model and future wife. Then Caillebotte. According to a critic writing in La Petite République Française, Caillebotte was more serious than his fellow Impressionist members, adding that the only commonality between Caillebotte and the Impressionists was the denomination. Yet this painting was rejected by the Salon, probably for its crude realism and large format. What I see is a man composed of defined and firm lines, a finished work which gives an impression of modern classicism. These craftsmen with elongated muscles almost appear to be the same body displayed from 3 angles, meaning that we have an impression of turning around a statue that Caillebotte studied from 3 angles. It is far away from the notion of Impressionism as having autonomous, short strokes. When you see Bridge of Europe, if it weren't for the violet-tinted reflections that were characteristic of the movement, then the perspective would have been worked perfectly. He has probably taken reference from photos, multiplied the preparatory studies, and perfected his composition. It is not a quick painting, stemming purely from nature. Now for Ludovic Piette. It was upon Pissarro's insistence that his friend Piette was admitted into impressionistic circles, but Piette's work remained primarily realistic. As for Raffaelli, his presence sowed discord between Gauguin and Degas. Here are his absinthe drinkers, exhibited at the 5th exhibition of the Impressionists, in which you have not an Impressionist painting, but a naturalistic one. The Impressionist strokes and colour palette are entirely absent. Faced with such stylistic disparities, I'd like to suggest an exercise where you try to come up with a possible definition of Impressionism. Let me begin by asking the following question. Did Impressionists occasionally paint impressions? By mistake? Never? We'll find out in our next and last chapter.